Jeannie Seely was the Miss Country soul of the Grand Ole Opry, but behind that legendary smile was a secret the institution fought to bury for over 50 years. Everyone knows the songs, but nobody knew about the dark mistake that happened behind those velvet curtains, a decision so controversial, it almost erased her from the history books forever. Today, we are finally opening the sealed letters and revealing what they never wanted you to hear. To understand the sheer magnitude of what happened to Jeannie Seely, you have to first understand the absolute, terrifying power of the Grand Ole Opry in the middle of the 20th century. This was not just a concert venue or a weekly radio show. It was the Vatican of country music. Sitting in Nashville, broadcasting over the 50,000-watt clear channel signal of WSM radio, the Opry could reach living rooms from the Deep South all the way to the Canadian border. If you were embraced by the Opry, you were royalty. If you were banished by the Opry, your career was effectively over. There was no internet, no alternative media, no independent route to the mainstream country audience. The men who ran the Opry held the keys to the kingdom, and they ran it with a suffocating, iron-fisted traditionalism. They sold a very specific image to the American public. It was all about wholesome, God-fearing family values, rustic charm, and absolute obedience to the Nashville establishment. Within this deeply entrenched system, women were assigned a very specific, highly restricted role. The unwritten rules of Music Row, whispered in the hallways and enforced by backstage managers, dictated exactly how a female artist was supposed to behave. You were expected to step up to the microphone, wearing a modest, ankle-length gingham dress with a high collar, perhaps adorned with some polite lace. You were expected to sing your song of heartbreak or devotion, smile sweetly, nod to the male host who had graciously allowed you on his stage, and then step back into the shadows. Women were decorative guests in the house that the men built. They were not leaders, they were not voices of authority, and they were certainly not allowed to express raw, modern sexuality or fierce independence. The Opry management believed that this rigid control was the secret to their financial success, and they viewed any deviation from this formula as a direct threat to their entire empire. Then came 1966, and the arrival of a woman who completely shattered the mold. Jeannie Seely was not a shrinking violet from a mountain holler. She possessed a sultry, blues-soaked voice that dripped with genuine, lived-in emotion, earning her the nickname Miss Country Soul. When she released her massive, Grammy-winning hit, Don't Touch Me, it was a revelation. It was sophisticated, it was intensely passionate, and it was undeniably modern. The Opry management realized they needed her star power to attract listeners, so they invited her to join the cast in 1967. But they severely miscalculated. They assumed that once she crossed the threshold of the Ryman Auditorium, she would surrender to the institution, conform to the gingham dress code, and play the submissive role they had designed for her. That assumption was the beginning of their dark mistake. The true collision between the unstoppable force of Jeannie Seely and the immovable object of the Grand Ole Opry occurred on a historic, highly documented night in late 1967. This was the night of the miniskirt controversy. To a modern audience, wearing a skirt that ends above the knee sounds incredibly trivial, almost laughable. But in the context of the conservative, heavily monitored stage of the Grand Ole Opry in the 1960s, it was an act of profound, explosive rebellion. Jeannie Seely walked through the backstage doors wearing a stylish, modern miniskirt. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. The backstage managers went into a state of absolute panic. We are talking about frantic phone calls to executives, hushed, panicked meetings in the narrow hallways of the Ryman, and desperate attempts to stop her from walking out into the spotlight. The management warned her that she was violating the sacred moral code of the institution. They insinuated that if she walked out there showing her knees, she would alienate the sponsors, offend the audience, and permanently destroy her career. But Jeannie did not back down. She recognized the hypocrisy of an institution that wanted to profit from her modern sound while desperately trying to trap her visual identity in the 19th century. She walked out onto the stage in that miniskirt and the audience gasped. And then something incredible happened. The sky did not fall. The sponsors did not pull their funding. In fact, the crowd absolutely loved it. They loved seeing a woman who looked like the modern world, a woman who owned her space and her body. But behind the scenes, the Nashville establishment was furious. They realized that they had lost a crucial visual battle, and this terrified them. The internal memos and the backstage whispers began to shift. The management realized they could not fire her outright because she was too popular. Her voice was too essential to the radio broadcast, and firing her over a skirt would make them look ridiculous to the mainstream media. So, they decided to implement a much darker, much more insidious strategy. They decided to strip her of her voice in a completely different way. This brings us to the core of the Opry's dark mistake, the systematic, deeply ingrained refusal to allow women to host segments of the broadcast. You have to understand the specific mechanics of how the Grand Ole Opry operated. The multi-hour radio show was broken down into smaller segments, each sponsored by a different company, like Martha White Flour or Purina. Each of these segments was anchored by a host. The host was the master of ceremonies. They held the ultimate power on stage. They introduced the other artists, they read the live commercial copy for the sponsors, they controlled the flow of the broadcast, and they bantered with the audience. Hosting was the ultimate symbol of authority and respect within the country music industry, and for decades the Opry management maintained a strict, unyielding rule. Only men could be hosts. Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, Bill Monroe, Porter Wagoner. The men held the podium. The men commanded the microphone. Women were only ever allowed to be guests. They were brought out by the male host, they performed their allotted 3 minutes, and they were dismissed. Jeannie Seely saw right through this invisible barrier. She understood that whoever controlled the microphone controlled the narrative. By denying women the right to host, the Opry was sending a clear, devastating message to millions of listeners across North America. They were saying that women were entirely incapable of leadership, that women could not be trusted to endorse a product, and that a woman's voice was only valuable when it was singing a melody, never when it was speaking with authority. The traditionalists in management fought tooth and nail to keep this system in place. They argued that the deep, authoritative timbre of a male voice was essential for selling products, that the rural audience would simply not accept a female master of ceremonies. They attempted to silence Jeannie's requests through bureaucratic delays, polite dismissals, and quiet threats that pushing too hard would result in her performances being mysteriously cut short. They thought they could wait her out, exhaust her, and eventually force her into a state of quiet compliance. But Jeannie Seely was a master strategist. She did not throw a singular loud tantrum that would have given them the excuse to label her difficult and fire her. Instead, she engaged in a relentless, calculated campaign of institutional dismantling. She spent years observing the men, learning the exact timing of the live commercial reads, memorizing the pacing of the syndicated broadcast, and building undeniable alliances with the musicians and the crucial sponsors. She gathered the unassailable data of her own immense popularity, proving that the fans tuned in specifically for her. She transformed herself into an undeniable asset that the sponsors desperately wanted associated with their brands. When the management tried to brush her off, she countered with pure logic and undeniable talent. She pointed out the sheer absurdity of the fact that women were the primary purchasers of the household goods being advertised on the Opry, yet they were not allowed to speak about them on stage. The dam finally broke, not out of the goodness of the management's hearts, but because the pressure Jeannie applied became impossible to ignore. When she finally stepped up to the podium to host her first segment, the tension in the room was electric. The old guard stood in the wings, arms crossed, secretly hoping she would stumble over the commercial copy, lose the audience, or freeze under the immense pressure of the live 50,000-watt broadcast. Instead, she delivered a masterclass in broadcasting. She was witty, she was completely commanding, her timing was flawless, and she connected with the audience on a level that many of the veteran male hosts could only dream of. In that single, historic segment, she completely shattered the myth of male broadcasting supremacy that the Opry had spent decades fiercely protecting. This single victory created a massive, unstoppable ripple effect throughout the entire music industry. The case studies of her influence are visible everywhere you look in modern country music. Because Jeannie Seely refused to be relegated to the shadows, the door was blown violently open for every female artist who followed. When you look at legends like Loretta Lynn, who began speaking her mind with unprecedented frankness, or Dolly Parton, who took absolute control of her own massive business empire and television presence, you are looking at the direct descendants of Jeannie Seely's fierce backstage battles. She proved that a female country artist did not have to choose between being respected and being authentically herself. Even today, when you tune into the Grand Ole Opry and see powerhouse female artists like Carrie Underwood or Carly Pearce seamlessly hosting segments, guiding the broadcast, and commanding the legendary Circle of Wood, it is entirely because Jeannie Seely took the arrows first. She exposed the deeply flawed logic of institutional gatekeeping. The Opry's attempt to marginalize her is now viewed as one of the most embarrassing corporate missteps in music history. They tried to protect their brand by silencing a visionary, but they ultimately learned that you cannot suppress a cultural evolution. The dark mistake was assuming that the velvet curtains of the Ryman Auditorium were thick enough to block out the changing winds of the real world. Jeannie Seely forced country music to grow up. She forced the executives to look at their own prejudice and realize that holding back women was not preserving tradition. It was just bad business. She remains a fiercely active legend today, a smiling assassin who beat the system by simply refusing to accept the limits they placed on her geometry. But the Grand Ole Opry is not the only massive music institution that tried to bury a controversial truth to protect its sparkling image. In fact, if you thought the intense backstage warfare over a miniskirt and a microphone was shocking, you will not believe the massive cover-up that occurred when Johnny Cash intentionally shattered the stage lights of the Opry during a drug-fueled rage, a story the executives spent millions trying to scrub from the archives. Click the video on your screen right now to uncover the incredible, hidden truth about the man in black's most destructive night.